The first organic molecule we'll discuss is carbohydrates. These are also called saccharides or sugars. One of the more common carbs is glucose. So let me draw glucose. So it is a hexagon. And here I'm drawing in the hydroxyl groups, the OH. So now let me count these vertices here. These are carbon atoms. 1 carbon, 2 carbon, 3 carbon, 4 carbon, 5 carbon, 6 carbon. So glucose has 6 carbons. There are 12 hydrogens, which I haven't shown here, but they're there. And then we have 6 oxygens. So this is glucose. And this is also a monosaccharide. Mono here, this means 1, as in 1 unit. Or you can think, if this doesn't help, think, 1 hexagon for glucose. So glucose is broken up to form energy in the form of ATP. In the form of ATP, which we'll discuss in a future lab. So now on to another sugar. This one is called maltose. And this is basically, you have 2 glucoses put together. So let me draw this in, all my hydroxyl groups. And it's going to bond with another glucose. So in this reaction, let me draw in these lone pairs. So the lone pair is there, lone pair is there. What happens is that this oxygen is going to attack this carbon, and then this lone pair is going to recede back onto this oxygen. And while all that happens, this is going to grab this hydrogen right there. And here's what we'll be left with. So there's that first glucose, and here is this new bond. And the second product here is water. That water that left. And this is maltose, which is a disaccharide. This prefix di means 2, so 2 units of glucose. Or again, you can think 2 hexagons. 2 hexagons. Now this reaction up here, this reaction here is called a dehydration reaction. It's called this because a water molecule, so right here, was removed from the reactants. So we'll say H2O was removed from the reactants. If this definition doesn't work for you, a second one is, in a dehydration reaction, we have water as a product. So this is a dehydration reaction. Okay, so now on to the next saccharide, which is starch. And this is how plants store glucose, as opposed to animals, which we'll get on to in a sec. So starch is basically a bunch of glucoses put together. like so. I'm going to put ... because there's many of them. So this is all just glucose molecules linked together by those dehydration reactions. So this is glucose, that's glucose, this is also glucose, and so forth. So starch is a polysaccharide. Polysaccharide. Prefix poly means many, as in many units, or you can think of it as many glucoses put together. And starch is how we store glucose, so we can break them up later when we need to make energy. But again, remember, this is only for plants. For animals, we call it something else. We call it glycogen. But it's the same thing. So this is for animals. And this is also a polymer of glucose. Of glucose units. One difference is that it's just bonded a bit differently. Bonded differently. So here is a diagram. Starch plants. Remember, starch is a storage form for plants. And then for humans, we just call it glycogen, and other animals also. But same glucoses that make up these structures. Okay, so now how to identify carbs in a test tube. One reagent that we'll be dealing with today, or dealt with today, is Benedict's. Benedict's reagent. And Benedict's will test positive for all monosaccharides. Some disaccharides. And then no, won't test for polysaccharides. Okay, so toss this in a tube, and if it reacts, you know what you have. Second reagent for today is called Lugol's. Lugol solution. Or you can just call this iodine in a solution form, or iodine. And this tests for polysaccharides, like starch. Like starch. Okay, so that takes care of carbohydrates. Now to discuss lipids, we have to first explain polarity for a bit. And I'm going to start by using a polar molecule that we all know, and this is water. People tell you it's polar, but how do you know? And we'll explain how we know this is a polar molecule. First thing you have to do, though, is determine the electronegativity. Determine the electronegativity of atoms. And you can do this by looking at the periodic table. So let's go to our periodic table. The only elements we're concerned with are these guys, and then just this hydrogen over here. The general trend for electronegativity is the further up and right you go, the more electronegative you are. And the further down to the left, this is less electronegative. So according to this, oxygen is more electronegative. So in terms of electronegativity, oxygen is more electronegative than hydrogen. So now I can assign partial charges to this structure. Partial negative for oxygens and partial positive for hydrogens. And this symbol here, delta, this means partial. As in not a full charge. Not a full charge. So now I'm going to draw arrows going from positives to negatives. So there are my two arrows. Okay, let me go down here. Let me make some more space. So here were my two arrows that I drew. If I were to take the sum of these arrows, it'll be something like this. Again, this was our negative, this was the positive end, and here is our negative end. So here is the negative side, but instead of calling it side, we're going to call this a pole, a negative pole. And here is the positive pole. And you know, the fact that two poles exist, by definition, we call this polar. Exist. Since two poles exist, right there, we call H2O polar. H2O polar. So this is why a water molecule is considered polar. Okay, so now these polar molecules, they'll act like magnets, and they're going to orient themselves to maximize opposite charge attraction. So what do I mean by that? So let me draw my water again. This was my delta positive. Here are my delta negatives. So down below, I'm just going to write those charges, those partial charges. Now, if another water molecule comes along, it's going to orient itself like this. Again, same water molecule, so same partial charges. It's going to orient itself like this, and this is the negative. So this is our first water molecule, and this is another one that just happens to be nearby. And it's going to configure itself to maximize this opposite charge attraction. So this is how water molecules will orient themselves. Okay, so we discussed a polar molecule. Now for a non-polar molecule. We're going to start with methane, and methane is CH4. So it's going to be a carbon linked to 4 of these hydrogens. To determine polarity, it's going to be the same process. Determine electronegativity of the atoms. Again, you look at your periodic table. So let's go back to our periodic table. So we see that carbon is farther to the right, so it should be considered more electronegative. But here's one exception to our rule. For our purposes, the electronegativity of carbon is the same as hydrogens. So we cannot assign partial charges because they're the same essentially. So no partial positives, no partial negatives. Thus, there's no poles. And then by definition, we call this non-polar. I'll see you in the next video.